Racist cop accuses a Filipino man in the park until he discovers a shocking truth. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in New York City, a place known for its melting pot of cultures and diverse communities. The bustling streets just beyond Brooklyn's Prospect Park were alive with energy, filled with people of all backgrounds going about their day. But deep within the park, under the shade of a large oak tree, Miguel Reyes sat alone, lost in his thoughts. Miguel was a quiet, hard-working man, a Filipino immigrant who had lived in the U.S. for years. He kept to himself, never causing trouble, and worked long shifts at a local hospital as a medic, saving lives while asking for little in return. Despite his gentle nature, Miguel had seen more than his fair share of struggles, having faced discrimination and hardships as he tried to build a life in a new country. That afternoon, as he enjoyed a moment of peace, Officer Mark Reynolds was making his usual rounds through the park. Reynolds had been with the NYPD for over a decade, earning a reputation for being strict and relentless, particularly toward minorities. He claimed he was just doing his job, but many knew that his preconceived biases shaped the way he handled situations. Then, his eyes locked onto Miguel, a lone man sitting quietly wearing a dark hoodie, just like the description of a suspect reported earlier. The radio in Reynolds' patrol car had mentioned an individual involved in a string of thefts in the area, and to the officer, Miguel fit the bill. Reynolds immediately felt suspicion creep in. Why was this man sitting alone? Was he waiting for an accomplice? Planning something? Without a second thought, he stormed toward Miguel, already convinced he had found his culprit. But what Officer Reynolds didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined, was that Miguel wasn't just an ordinary man. He was someone who had risked his life for others, someone whose name had been honored before. And in the next few minutes, Reynolds would discover something so shocking, so humbling, that it would change his life forever. Miguel sat alone on the park bench, quietly scrolling through his phone, enjoying the crisp afternoon air. Birds chirped in the distance, and the faint laughter of children playing nearby echoed through the open space. It was a peaceful, ordinary day, until it wasn't. Officer Mark Reynolds, a seasoned cop with a hardened exterior, strode toward Miguel with a purpose. His sharp eyes scanned the man before him, his gaze filled with suspicion. He had been patrolling the area when he received a vague report about a suspicious-looking individual lingering around the park. He didn't have much to go on. No name, no details, just a loose description. And Miguel fit that description. Reynolds came to a halt in front of Miguel, standing tall, hand resting on his belt near his holster. He cleared his throat, his voice gruff and authoritative. "Sir, can I ask what you're doing here?" Miguel looked up, slightly startled. He saw the uniform, the badge, the look in the officer's eyes. He had encountered this kind of questioning before, and it rarely ended well. Still, he kept his voice calm. "I'm just sitting here, waiting for someone," he answered, offering a small, non-threatening smile. Reynolds' expression remained unmoved. He glanced around as if searching for an accomplice, his posture rigid. "Waiting for someone?" he repeated, skepticism dripping from his tone. "For how long?" Miguel furrowed his brows slightly. "I don't know. 15 minutes, maybe 20? Is there a problem, officer?" Reynolds folded his arms. "We've had reports about people hanging around this area, casing the neighborhood. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Miguel's jaw tightened. "No, sir, I don't." Reynolds took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You sure about that?" The tension was palpable. A few passers-by had slowed their steps, casually observing. Others, more discreet, had already pulled out their phones, recording. Miguel noticed but didn't react. He had nothing to hide. Still, he could feel the energy shift. The officer's tone, his posture. It wasn't a routine check anymore. It was an assumption of guilt. Miguel had seen this before. "Sir," Miguel spoke carefully, maintaining eye contact. "I'm just waiting for a friend. I don't know what else to tell you." Reynolds exhaled sharply. "You got ID on you?" Miguel hesitated, then slowly reached into his back pocket, careful not to make any sudden movements. He retrieved his wallet and handed over his driver's license. Reynolds snatched it, glancing at the name. Miguel Reyes. The officer studied it for a long moment. Then, instead of handing it back immediately, he examined Miguel again. His clothes, his face, his body language, searching for something, anything, that might validate his suspicion. Miguel felt his pulse quicken. He had done nothing wrong. He had followed every request, remained calm, yet he could see it in the officer's face. He was still being judged. "Everything all right, officer?" Miguel asked, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. Reynolds barely acknowledged him. He flipped the ID back and forth between his fingers, as if expecting it to reveal some hidden truth. The small crowd watching grew larger. A woman whispered to her friend, shaking her head. Another man, a jogger, had stopped running, now standing with his arms crossed. More phones were up now, capturing the moment in real time. Miguel exhaled, his patience wearing thin. "Sir, I don't know why you're treating me like this. I've done nothing wrong." Reynolds' jaw clenched. He could hear the murmurs around him, the growing unrest. He had to make a decision. Then, just as he was about to say something, there was a sudden shout from behind. A voice, loud and desperate. "Miguel!" Everyone turned. A well-dressed older man was rushing toward them, waving his hands. His face was a mix of urgency and relief. Reynolds straightened, instinctively taking a step back. The man, slightly out of breath, finally reached them, his eyes locked on Miguel. And what he said next changed everything. "Miguel, I've been looking for you." The tension in the air crackles like a live wire. The officer's grip on Miguel tightens for a moment before he hesitates, his brow furrowing. The old man, breathless but determined, pushes through the gathered crowd. His polished shoes click against the pavement, his silver hair slightly disheveled from urgency. His voice, though laced with relief, carries a weight of authority that makes even Officer Reynolds straighten up. "Let him go. You don't know who he is," the old man demands. Reynolds, caught off guard, releases his hold slightly but doesn't step back. His suspicious gaze flickers between the old man and Miguel, whose expression now shifts from frustration to recognition. "Sir?" Miguel mutters, eyes wide. The old man reaches Miguel's side, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. His grip is not just one of familiarity, it is one of gratitude. He turns toward Officer Reynolds, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" he asks, his voice tinged with incredulity. Reynolds stiffens, his defensive instincts kicking in. "He matches a suspect's description," he mutters, though his voice lacks the certainty it carried earlier. The old man scoffs. "A suspect? That's rich. This man is a hero." He turns to the crowd, raising his voice so that everyone can hear. Miguel Reyes is a decorated military medic. He saved dozens of lives on the battlefield, soldiers, civilians, even enemies. And just last month, he saved a child from drowning in the river. A murmur ripples through the onlookers. Some gasp, others exchange glances, whispering among themselves. Reynolds blinks, the words hitting him like a sudden gust of wind. His hand loosens completely, and Miguel steps back, rubbing his wrist where the officer had gripped him moments earlier. The name suddenly clicks. Reynolds had seen it before, Miguel Reyes. His memory flashes to a newspaper article from just a few weeks ago. A grainy photograph of a modest-looking Filipino man cradling a small, shivering child had been printed beneath the bold headline, "Immigrant War. Hero rescues drowning boy. A true act of bravery." A pang of recognition and shame washes over Reynolds like a cold wave. He remembers reading about it during his morning coffee, skimming through the story without much thought. It had detailed how Miguel, while simply passing by the river, had heard desperate screams from a mother whose child had slipped into the fast-moving current. Without hesitation, Miguel had jumped into the freezing water, fighting against the pull of the current, battling exhaustion and the weight of the child. He had risked his own life to bring the boy to safety, performing CPR until paramedics arrived. And here he was, being treated like a criminal. Reynolds swallows hard, his throat dry. He remembers another part of the article, Miguel's background, He had served as a medic in the U.S. Army, deployed overseas in high-risk combat zones. Despite not being born in America, he had risked his life for it, patching up wounded soldiers, running headfirst into enemy fire to pull his comrades to safety. And now, here he stood, being wrongfully accused because of a mere assumption. Reynolds feels something twist in his gut. The weight of his own bias, his own mistake, presses heavily on his chest. He had prided himself on being a fair cop, on upholding justice. But right now, justice had been far from what he had delivered. The old man's voice shakes Reynolds out of his thoughts. You saw a brown man sitting alone, and you assumed he was trouble. His tone is not just disappointed, it's accusatory. The crowd murmurs in agreement. Some pull out their phones, already recording. Miguel exhales, shaking his head. His voice, calm and measured, cuts through the noise. You judged me without knowing me. Reynolds looks at him, then at the people around them. He sees expectation in their eyes, judgment in their expressions. His heartbeat pounds against his ribs. For the first time in a long time, Officer Reynolds feels ashamed. Reynolds stood frozen, his breath shallow, as the weight of his actions crushed him. The realization struck him like a tidal wave. He had just humiliated and mistreated a man who had given everything for this country, for people like him, for the very principles of honor and justice he had sworn to uphold. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, and the judgmental stares from the growing crowd around him burned into his skin. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers, some shaking their heads in disgust. A few stepped forward, their voices rising in indignation. This man is a hero, and you treated him like a criminal, one woman shouted, her phone still recording. Shame on you, another person yelled, his face contorted with anger. A teenager, holding a phone up to capture the moment, turned to Miguel. Sir, do you want to press charges? We all saw what he did. Miguel, who had remained silent throughout the storm of accusations against Reynolds, let out a deep sigh. He met the officer's eyes, not with hatred, not with bitterness, but with a deep, solemn understanding. His voice was calm, yet firm. You judged me without knowing me, Miguel said, his words cutting through the air like a blade. He stepped forward, closing the gap between them. But now you do. The words carried a weight that pressed down on Reynolds like an unbearable burden. His own prejudices, his own deeply ingrained biases, had led him to profile an innocent man, a man who had risked his life for others, without asking for anything in return. The very fabric of the authority Reynolds thought he stood for unraveled before him. For the first time in his career, Reynolds felt truly ashamed. His eyes dropped to the ground as he swallowed back the lump in his throat. His badge, once a symbol of his pride, now felt like an unbearable weight on his chest. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to Miguel, his voice shaking as he finally spoke. I was wrong, Reynolds admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Then, louder, with the conviction of a man seeking redemption. I was wrong, and I am sorry. The crowd fell silent for a moment, surprised by the officer's public admission. Some nodded in approval, while others remained skeptical. But Miguel, his face still calm, offered a small nod. He had seen war, pain, and suffering. He knew that true strength was not in revenge, but in forgiveness. The video recording the incident would later go viral. People from all over the world would debate it, some outraged, others moved. It would spark conversations about bias, injustice, and the power of accountability. As Miguel walked away, he left behind more than just a lesson for one man. He left behind a story that would remind the world that assumptions can destroy, but understanding can heal. Never judge someone by their appearance. Every person has a story. We live in a world where appearances often lead to snap judgments. But behind every face, there is a story. One filled with struggles, triumphs, and experiences that shape who we are. What if the person you judged unfairly had overcome unimaginable hardships? What if they had a past that could inspire you? Miguel's story is a reminder that kindness and understanding should come before assumptions. He was accused of something he never did, simply because he fit a description. But in the end, the truth came out. He was a hero, a survivor, a man of integrity. This is why we should always take a step back before jumping to conclusions about others. Prejudice and discrimination thrive on ignorance, but they can be defeated with awareness, education, and open conversations. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced or witnessed discrimination? How did you handle it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to stand up for what's right. If this message resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share this video to help spread awareness. The more people understand the power of empathy, the closer we get to a world that treats everyone with the respect they deserve. Yay, heart.